Imagine winters so savage that entire villages simply disappeared. Imagine years where summer never came, where crops rotted in frozen fields, and where parents made unthinkable choices just to survive one more day. This isn't a fantasy novel or a horror story. This is the terrifying reality of medieval Europe during the Little Ice Age, a climate catastrophe that brought civilization to its knees. Before we journey into this frozen nightmare, make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Trust me, you don't want to miss our explorations of history's most dramatic moments. And drop a comment. Have you ever experienced whether that changed everything? Let's dive in to understand the horror that was coming. We need to first picture medieval Europe at its absolute peak, the medieval warm period. Lasting from roughly 950 to 1250 AD, these 3 centuries were Europe's golden age, a time when the climate was so favorable that it seemed like God himself had blessed the continent. During this warm period, vineyards flourished in England as far north as Yorkshire. Today, that sounds impossible, but back then, English wine was commonplace and even exported. The Vikings weren't just raiders. They were successful colonizers, establishing thriving settlements in Greenland that actually lived up to its name. Green pastures stretched across land that would later become frozen wasteland, supporting cattle and sheep in abundance. Europe's population exploded. From about 35 million people in the year 1000, the numbers nearly doubled to 80 million by 1300. Cities expanded rapidly, transforming from small fortified towns into bustling centers of commerce and culture. This was the age of magnificent Gothic cathedrals reaching toward heaven, of universities being founded across the continent, of Marco Polo's legendary journeys to the Far East. The agricultural revolution transformed food production. New farming techniques like the heavy plow and the 3-field crop rotation system meant that yields increased dramatically. Forests were cleared to make room for more farmland. Every available piece of land was put under cultivation. Markets overflowed with grain, vegetables, and livestock. The surplus food allowed people to specialize. You had artisans, merchants, scholars, and artists, all supported by reliable agricultural abundance. But this prosperity created a deadly trap. The population had grown to exactly match what the land could support during optimal conditions. There was no margin for error, no buffer zone, no backup plan. Medieval Europe was like a circus performer who had climbed to the top of a high wire. Without realizing, the safety net had been removed. Every piece of arable land was being farmed. The forests that might have provided emergency food sources were gone. Society had become completely dependent on perfect weather continuing forever. The people of this era couldn't have known what was coming. They had no concept of climate cycles or long-term weather patterns. They believed the warmth and abundance were God's permanent blessing on Christendom. The chroniclers wrote with confidence and optimism about their expanding world. They had no idea that their grandchildren would face a nightmare. Around the year 1300, something fundamental shifted in Earth's climate system. Scientists today still debate the exact causes: reduced solar activity, increased volcanic eruptions spewing ash into the atmosphere, changes in ocean currents. Probably all of these factors conspired together in a perfect storm of climatic catastrophe. Whatever the cause, the effects were swift and brutal. The Little Ice Age didn't creep in. Gradually it announced itself with savage authority. The winter of 1309-1310 brought the first shocking warnings. Across Europe, temperatures plummeted to levels that no living person had experienced. Rivers that rarely froze became solid ice. The Thames in London froze completely, something that would happen again and again in the coming centuries. But this was just the opening act. Then came 1315, a year seared into the collective memory of medieval Europe as the beginning of the end. In April, the spring rains began. Normal enough, except they didn't stop. They continued through May, through June, through the entire summer and into autumn. From April to September, cold, driving rain hammered the countryside relentlessly. Picture this. You're a medieval peasant. You've planted your wheat, barley, and rye as you've done every year of your life. But instead of the warm sun needed for crops to grow, there's just endless rain. The fields turn into swamps. Your carefully planted seeds rot in waterlogged soil. The grain that does manage to sprout is attacked by mold and fungus that thrives in the damp conditions. By harvest time, there's almost nothing to harvest. The hay couldn't be cut and dried to feed livestock through winter. Salt, crucial for preserving meat, couldn't be produced because seawater couldn't evaporate. The price of food didn't just increase, it exploded. Within months, grain prices tripled, then quadrupled, then went even higher. But even gold couldn't buy what didn't exist. The winter of 1315 to 1316 arrived like an executioner. Brutal cold gripped the land. Snow came early and deep. Livestock, already weakened by poor summer grazing and lack of stored fodder, began dying in massive numbers. Then a livestock plague, murrains wept through herds, already stressed by hunger and cold. Cattle, sheep, pigs, horses, they perished by the thousands across Europe. And then, impossibly, the pattern repeated. Spring 1316 brought more rain. Summer brought more rain. Autumn, more rain. This wasn't a bad year, this was the new normal. For 7 consecutive years, the weather refused to cooperate. Growing seasons shortened as late spring frosts and early autumn frosts narrowed the window for cultivation. The sun became a stranger, hidden behind perpetual grey clouds. Contemporary chroniclers wrote with mounting horror. One monk recorded, "The rains did not cease, day or night, and the land became as a lake." Another wrote, "The people cried out to God for mercy, but the heavens remained closed." A third, more darkly, "Hunger transformed men into beasts, and beasts into demons." The Great Famine of 1315-1322 wasn't simply a food shortage, was the complete collapse of medieval civilization as people knew it. Every system that held society together failed simultaneously. By 1316, food stores accumulated over generations were exhausted. A bushel of wheat that cost a few pennies before the crisis now cost several shillings, prices that put food beyond the reach of ordinary people. But even the wealthy faced a terrible reality. Money was worthless when there was nothing to buy. Merchants' warehouses stood empty. Noble granaries ran dry. Monasteries that had traditionally provided charity to the poor had nothing to give. In the cities, the streets became morgues. Bodies of the starved lay where they fell, too numerous for proper burial. Mass graves were dug outside city walls, but even these couldn't keep pace with the death toll. The living were often too weak to bury the dead. And then came horrors that chroniclers could barely bring themselves to record. Multiple sources from across Europe mention cannibalism, that ultimate taboo. In Poland, prisoners reportedly consumed each other. In Ireland, bodies were dug from graves for food. In Scotland, there were whispered accounts of parents killing their own children, while historians debate how widespread these acts truly were. The very fact that multiple independent chroniclers mentioned them reveals the depths of human desperation. Crime exploded as society's normal controls evaporated. Starving bands roamed the countryside, taking whatever food they could find by force. In cities, bread riots erupted regularly. Bakers suspected of hoarding grain were torn apart by mobs. The penalty for stealing food was death, but this deterred no one. People were dying anyway. The death toll was staggering. Conservative estimates suggest 10 to 25% of Northern Europe's population died during the Great Famine. In some regions, particularly in the far north, the mortality rate may have reached 30%. Entire villages were abandoned, left as ghost towns when the last inhabitants either fled or perished. Children suffered most terribly. An entire generation grew up malnourished, their bodies and brains permanently damaged by lack of food during critical developmental years. Those who survived to adulthood were noticeably smaller and weaker than their parents. This lost generation would be more susceptible to disease, setting the stage for an even greater catastrophe just decades away. But beyond the physical deaths, something else died during the Great Famine: the medieval worldview itself. The certainty that hard work would be rewarded, that God protected the faithful, that the world was fundamentally orderly and predictably, all of this crumbled when prayers went unanswered and priests starved alongside peasants. Faith itself became harder to maintain. The agricultural systems that had worked reliably for centuries simply failed. The heavy clay soils of northern Europe, so productive in the warm, dry summers of the medieval warm period, became impossible to work when cold and waterlogged. Plows stuck in mud, seeds washed away or rotted. The few crops that did grow were attacked by blights and molds that flourished in damp conditions. The Great Famine officially ended around 1322, when weather patterns finally stabilized somewhat. But the Little Ice Age was far from over. It had only just begun. For the next several centuries, Europe would endure climate conditions markedly colder than anything experienced during the medieval warm. The pattern that emerged was insidious. There would be years, sometimes even decades, of manageable conditions. People would begin to relax, to believe the worst was over, and then another hammer blow would fall, a winter of exceptional brutality, a summer that never came, years of failed harvests. The 1340s brought more agricultural crises, and then, in 1347, the Black Death arrived, the plague, which would kill between 30 to 60% of Europe's population, found victims perfectly prepared for it, weakened by decades of malnutrition, living in crowded, unsanitary conditions, with immune systems compromised by constant hunger. Would the Black Death have been as devastating if it had struck during the prosperity of the medieval warm period? We'll never know, but the Little Ice Age certainly made Europe more vulnerable. The decades and centuries that followed saw the cold become the new normal. The Baltic Sea, which rarely froze during the medieval warm period, now regularly became solid ice for months. The growing season shortened by weeks, making marginal agricultural land completely unviable. Alpine glaciers advanced down mountain valleys, consuming pastures and sometimes entire villages. The winter of 1407 to 1408 saw the Rhine freeze so solidly that armies could march across it. In 1434, a winter of such extreme cold struck that wolves, driven mad by hunger, reportedly invaded cities in France and Germany, attacking people in the streets. The year 1453, when Constantinople fell to the Ottomans, saw the wine harvest fail across Europe, as if nature itself marked the end of an era. But the 17th century brought the coldest conditions of all. The winter of 1607-1608 saw the Bosphorus Strait freeze, an event so rare it was recorded as either a miracle or an omen. The decade of the 1690s brought what climatologists now recognize as perhaps the coldest period of the entire Little Ice Age. Scotland's ill years of 1695 to 1699 killed an estimated 15% of the Scottish population through starvation and disease. Then came the winter of 1709, a winter that would become legendary. The Seine froze solid in Paris. Fruit trees exploded from the extreme cold. Wine froze in cellars. People froze to death inside their own homes. Some estimates suggest this single winter killed 600,000 people in France alone. The repeated climate disasters transformed European society fundamentally. The Viking colonies in Greenland, already struggling with cooling temperatures, were finally abandoned. The last confirmed contact with Greenland Norse was in the early 15th century. After that, silence. They likely starved or froze to death, or the survivors were absorbed into Inuit populations. An entire Norse civilization simply vanished. Despite the horror, humanity adapted. Medieval and early modern Europeans developed remarkable strategies for surviving conditions their ancestors never had to face. Architecture evolved dramatically. The open, great halls of earlier centuries with their central hearths, gave way to houses with multiple smaller rooms that could be heated more efficiently. Glass windows, once luxuries for only the wealthy, became increasingly common as people realized that sealing buildings against the cold was essential. In alpine regions, entire villages constructed underground tunnels connecting buildings, so residents could move around without exposing themselves to deadly winter weather. Clothing underwent a revolution. Knitting technology spread across Europe, producing warmer garments than woven cloth alone. Multiple layers became standard practice. The wealthy wore elaborate fur-lined robes and cloaks. Even poor peasants learned to stuff their clothing with straw or down for insulation. That iconic image of the heavily bundled early modern European wasn't fashion. It was survival technology. Food preservation techniques improved out of necessity. Smoking, salting, and pickling became more sophisticated sciences. Root cellars were dug deeper and better insulated. The wealthy built ice houses, underground chambers, where ice harvested from frozen ponds in winter could be stored for months. Communities pooled resources, with communal granaries becoming more common. Agricultural innovation accelerated. Farmers developed cold-resistant crop varieties through careful, selective breeding over generations. Crop rotation systems became more sophisticated. Drainage improved to handle wetter conditions. Farmers learned to identify and utilize microclimates. A south-facing slope with good drainage might mean the difference between harvest and starvation. But perhaps most importantly, European society became more technologically innovative overall. The scientific revolution emerged during this period of crisis, when traditional explanations failed and traditional authorities couldn't solve problems. People began developing new ways of understanding the world. Systematic observation, the experimental method, mathematical analysis, all the foundations of modern science developed, partly as responses to an increasingly unpredictable world. The Little Ice Age also drove European expansion. When traditional agricultural lands couldn't support the population, Europeans looked outward. The age of exploration, beginning in the 15th century, was partly a response to resource scarcity at home. The search for new trade routes, new lands, and new resources had profound consequences that would reshape the entire world. The Little Ice Age didn't end suddenly like its beginning. The warming was gradual and uneven, but by the mid-19th century, temperatures began climbing back toward medieval levels. The final death throes brought some spectacular events. The year 1816 became known as the year without a summer, though. This was caused by the eruption of Mount Tambora in Indonesia. It occurred during the tail end of the Little Ice Age. Snow fell in June in New England. Mary Shelley, trapped indoors by gloomy weather, wrote Frankenstein. But by the 1850s, the tide had clearly turned. Glaciers that had advanced for centuries began retreating. The Thames held its last frost fair. In 1814, the river would never freeze solid again. Growing seasons lengthened. The agricultural productivity that had been so tenuous during the Little Ice Age finally stabilized and then surged. So what can we learn from this centuries-long nightmare? First, the Little Ice Age demonstrates that climate is far more variable than we typically assume. Medieval Europeans came to see the warm period as normal and permanent. They built a society optimized for those conditions. When the climate changed, the results were catastrophic. Today, as we face anthropogenic climate change, we might remember that our grandparents' climate may not be our grandchildren's climate. Second, small temperature changes have massive consequences. The average temperature difference between the medieval warm period and the depths of the Little Ice Age was only about 1 to 2 degrees Celsius. That's it. 2 degrees made the difference between prosperity and famine, between population growth and population collapse. Anyone dismissing modern climate projections of similar magnitude should consider what those changes meant for our ancestors. Third, society's vulnerability depends on its margin of resilience. Medieval Europe had grown to exactly match the land's carrying capacity during optimal conditions. When conditions worsened, there was no buffer. Modern society has created enormous food surpluses in some regions, but we've also created new vulnerabilities: complex supply chains, just-in-time delivery, populations concentrated in cities far from food sources. Fourth, climate change is a threat multiplier. The Little Ice Age didn't just cause crop failures, contributed to famines, plagues, wars, witch hunts, massive migrations, and political collapse. Climate stress revealed and amplified every existing weakness in society. Modern climate change will likely do the same. Fifth, adaptation is possible, but costly. Europeans eventually adapted to Little Ice Age conditions, but the process took centuries and cost millions of lives. The societies that emerged were fundamentally different: smaller, more technologically advanced in some ways, and marked by trauma. Adaptation isn't a simple switch. It's a long, painful process of trial, error, and suffering. Finally, the Little Ice Age reminds us that climate change has mostly losers. While some regions and some social classes fared better than others, the overall impact was overwhelmingly negative. The idea that climate change might have benefits would have seemed absurd to someone starving during the Great Famine. The brutal winters of the Little Ice Age nearly erased medieval life as Europeans knew it. From our comfortable modern perspective, it's almost impossible to truly comprehend the suffering. Winters so cold that major rivers froze solid for months. Summers so wet and cool that crops rotted in the fields. Generation after generation, knowing nothing but scarcity, hunger, and cold, millions died. Entire civilizations faltered and sometimes disappeared, yet humanity somehow survived. Through innovation, cooperation, and sheer determination, our ancestors weathered centuries of climate adversity. The societies that emerged from this crucible were hardened, creative, and expansionist. The foundations of the modern world were laid during this period of crisis. The Little Ice Age shaped our world in profound ways. The lessons learned about agriculture, architecture, and social organization still influence us. The cultural memory of those cold centuries preserved in art, literature, and tradition reminds us that climate stability is not guaranteed. Today, we face a different climate challenge: warming rather than cooling, driven by human activity rather than natural cycles. But the speed of modern climate change far exceeds the gradual onset of the Little Ice Age. Will we respond with the wisdom and determination our ancestors showed, or will we wait until crisis forces change upon us? The story of the Little Ice Age is ultimately about resilience and adaptation, but also about the terrible cost of environmental change. It's a reminder that climate matters profoundly, that seemingly small temperature changes have enormous real-world consequences, and that preparation is far better than reaction. If this journey through history's frozen nightmare has fascinated you, make sure you're subscribed to our channel with notifications turned on. We've got more incredible historical deep dives coming your way every week. Hit that like button if you learned something new today, and share this video with anyone who thinks climate doesn't matter. Drop a comment below. What surprised you most about the Little Ice Age? Remember, those who don't learn from history are doomed to repeat it, and trust me, we don't want to repeat this particular chapter. Thanks for watching, stay curious, and I'll see you in the next video where we'll explore more of history's most dramatic moments. Until then, stay warm, stay informed, and never take stable weather for granted.